I never believed in the strange. I believed in records, paper trails, and what could be measured. For over 20 years, I worked as an archival technician for a regional museum in northern England. Dust, silence, and the careful breath of forgotten stories were my daily companions. It was in the winter of 1978 when the idea first came to me to revisit my old voice recordings. Back in the early 60s, I had kept a spoken diary on a Soviet-made reel-to-reel recorder that I had bought in a surplus shop in Leeds. Not out of narcissism, but from a curiosity about time, about memory. I was 21 when I recorded the first entry. I spoke about daily events, what I ate, whom I met, what articles I read, mostly trivial things. I had abandoned the habit by the time I was 25. The tapes had sat untouched in a rusting metal tin under my floorboards for over 15 years. When I opened the tin, the reels were cold, brittle to the touch, and smelled of old cloth and damp iron. I threaded one onto the recorder, ran the magnetic strip carefully through the heads, and pressed play. The room, lit only by the orange glow of a floor lamp, filled with the crackling hiss of aged tape, then my younger voice, clear, precise, almost too formal. But then, 2 minutes into the fourth recording, something changed. The voice was still mine, but strained, slurred, but not drunk, timed wrong. The words came haltingly, as though someone unfamiliar with my own tongue was learning how to shape the sounds. It didn't follow the tone or rhythm I had ever used. I said things I didn't remember saying. The windows are wrong again. Don't answer the man in the hallway. And then, he's already near. That phrase froze me. I stopped the tape, rewound it slightly, and played it again. He's already near. I remembered no such entry. I had never spoken about anyone being near. Certainly not in those exact, rigid syllables. I assumed at first a fault in the tape. Magnetic corruption, maybe. Some overlapping from another recording, but I only ever used that recorder for the diary. I never taped radio, never lent it, and the voice, despite the distortion, was mine. I sat in silence for almost an hour after hearing it. The room felt colder than usual. My dog, a quiet terrier named Rook, paced near the door with his ears drawn back. He kept glancing at the stairwell, then me, then back again. That night, I slept poorly. I dreamt of hearing breathing, not in my dream, but outside it, as though I was dreaming the dream from inside another room, and the real room had someone in it. 2 days later, I tried another reel. This one was from March of 1964. I recalled the day well. There had been snowfall, and I had visited the library to copy census logs. The tape began normal. A younger me recounting the walk through icy streets, the low light in the reading hall. Then a pause, a long one. 20 seconds of silence. And then I said, "Don't record this. He listens." I had no memory of that. I never referred to anyone as he in my tapes. I was a solitary man, and I'd never written or spoken about a second party in the context of the recordings. It was as though the diary had begun documenting someone else. That week, things began to disappear. At first, I thought it was my forgetfulness. A handkerchief left somewhere, a cup moved from the sink, but then a book vanished. Spirits and Myth in Northern Settlements, a thick, blue-spined volume I had owned since university. It was always on my study shelf, far right, next to Moorland Traditions. It simply wasn't there. I searched every room. Nothing. A week later, I found it in the basement, lying on top of the fuse box. I had not entered the basement in over a month. The dog grew restless at night. He barked once at the empty coat stand. Another time, he refused to enter the study, just froze at the door and growled. He'd never done that before. Then came the recorder incident. I was upstairs, brushing my teeth, when I heard it. A soft click, then the low hum of spooling tape. I rushed down. The recorder was running. I hadn't touched it in 2 days. I stopped it, rewound, played. Static, then a breath. Not my breath. Slow, close to the microphone. Then silence. I checked the window locks, all secure. I lived alone. My nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I stopped using the recorder. I placed it back in the tin and sealed the lid with thick binding tape. I told myself it was old electronics malfunctioning switches, but that didn't explain the voice, or the phrases I never remembered saying, or the fact that they matched no time or day that I could recall. I tried telling a colleague at the museum, David Mars, a conservator of folk archives. I framed it as a curiosity. He listened to a sample and frowned. "That's not tape error," he said. "Someone recorded over part of it. Deliberately." But he also noted, "If that's your voice, it's a damn close mimic, because it doesn't match the earlier sections." He returned the tape to me and didn't want to hear more. That was when I began writing everything down. Not just for record, but for safety. The voice, if it was mine, was saying things in places I never remembered. It spoke of things I hadn't seen. It hinted at a presence I couldn't explain, and I started to wonder, what else had I forgotten? By early February, something changed in the way I occupied the house. I found myself keeping the radio on during dinner, even though I didn't listen to it. The sound of voices, distant, impersonal, often in foreign languages, felt like a barrier between me and whatever silence was gathering in the corners of the rooms. The house had always been cold in winter, but this was different. Heat radiators hissed as usual, but the air in the hallway remained still and dry, like in a chapel or vault. On the 5th of the month, I came home from the museum to find the kitchen door open. I always closed it behind me. Rook was agitated again, scratching near the lower cabinets, ears drawn so tight they looked folded. I checked the latch and found no damage. Nothing had been stolen, nothing moved. But in the dust on the tiled floor, there was a trail 3 uneven streaks, like someone dragging the edge of a bag or thick cloth. But they started in the middle of the room, not at the threshold. I avoided the recorder after that, but sometimes I would still hear it. It was subtle, a metallic tick, the soft scrape of the internal wheel resetting. Once I stood in the hallway for 5 full minutes, listening to the silence, knowing it would begin just as I turned my back. And it did. I spun around and caught it, a tiny click, like the push of the playhead against the tape. I ripped open the tin. The recorder was still off, or seemed off, but the reel had advanced by nearly 1 foot. The tape was slightly warm to the touch. There was nothing plugged in. No timer, no switch that could have triggered it. I took the batteries out entirely and locked the whole thing in the filing cabinet in my study. But 3 nights later, I woke to the sound of it running again. That night, I slept in the living room with the lights on. I placed the dog's basket beside the couch, and I held my pocket knife open under the blanket, not for real protection, but for the illusion of it. At about 3 in the morning, I heard breathing again. Only this time it wasn't on tape. It came from upstairs. Heavy, strained, but regular. Not a wheeze or a cough, but like someone pacing a room, stopping at the window, then breathing once before stepping away. Rook sat up rigid in his basket, head turned toward the stairwell, unmoving. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The sound stopped. I waited another hour before daring to move. When I went upstairs with the poker from the fireplace, there was no one. But the frost on the window pane in the hall bathroom had been smeared, like someone's breath had melted the pattern. On the 12th, I visited the only person I knew who might make sense of it. Margaret Kell, a former researcher from our historical society. She had worked on audio restoration for the military archives during the late 40s. I brought her the tape, the one with the phrase, "He's already near," and I told her I suspected magnetic interference. She lived alone as well, in a small brick cottage behind the river bridge, surrounded by bird cages and yellowing newspapers. She listened in silence, once, then again, then narrowed her eyes and asked me, "Do you know about acoustic shadows?" I didn't. She explained that certain rooms, especially those with thick walls and old materials plaster, lead, stone, could retain sound in strange ways. Not like an echo, more like a trapped vibration. But this, she said, wasn't that. This isn't reverberation, this is insertion. Someone or something has added to your voice. You're not just repeating, you're being overwritten. I asked her if it could be radio bleed or some electrical anomaly. She shook her head. Only if your house is built inside a transmitter. She paused then and looked straight at me. This voice, it's learning your cadence. You notice that? At first it stumbles, but by the end, it breathes with you. That stayed with me. I left her cottage with a dry mouth and a tight chest. That night, I tried not to sleep. I sat with my notes, reviewing old blueprints of the house. It was built in 1897, originally a schoolmaster's residence. There was no radio tower nearby, no underground wiring save for the municipal cable that ran along the main road a quarter-mile away. But I noticed something else. The basement wall, north-facing, was oddly thick, almost 30 inches, which was unusual for the period. The architect's notes described it as a retaining barrier, but there was no slope or hill to retain, just flat moorland beyond the fence. On the 15th, I brought down a crowbar and a flashlight. I decided to inspect that wall. It was damp, like the rest of the basement, but there was something about the concrete at the bottom, darker, as if newer. I scraped at it with the metal claw, and the surface gave slightly, flaked in layers. That was when I heard it, a single thud from inside the wall. Not hollow like a pipe, not faint like plumbing. A full, thick sound. A knock. I dropped the bar. For a long time, I didn't move. Rook had followed me halfway down the steps, but stopped as soon as the sound came. He whined, turned, and ran upstairs. I left the basement in darkness. I locked the door with an iron latch and nailed a wooden board across it. I told myself I was being foolish, overly imaginative. Stress, memory decay, residual fear from the tapes. But that night, I woke to find the board removed, not broken, unscrewed and leaning neatly against the wall beside the door. I began to document everything in a single ledger location: time, objects disturbed, temperature shifts, sounds. It was the only way to maintain order, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing structure. The morning after the basement board had been removed, I found Rook crouched in the vestibule, tail curled so tightly under his body it trembled. He had urinated on the floor, something he had never done in the house. His eyes were wide, glassy, fixed on the stairwell, as though expecting something to descend. I cleaned the floor silently and didn't speak a word aloud all day. Around noon, I checked the filing cabinet. The recorder was still inside, batteries removed, untouched. But one of the reels had been fully rewound. I knew it had been left at mid-spool. I took it out, held it up to the light. In the strip near the end, a thin scratch had formed a diagonal cut across the oxide surface. Deliberate, as if something sharp had moved across it. That same afternoon, I developed a nosebleed while shelving binders at the museum. I hadn't had one since I was a child. The flow was sudden, unprovoked. The janitor, a quiet man named Ellis, offered me a cloth and asked if I was all right. I told him yes, though I wasn't sure. I went home early, collected all the tapes, placed them back into the tin box, and buried them under the shed in the garden. I dug nearly 3 feet down, through frozen soil and root-twisted earth. Then I poured a layer of kerosene into the hole before covering it. Not to burn, but to make me think twice before digging again. That night, I slept without dreams, but in the morning, there were footprints on the carpet. Not heavy, bare, human. They started near the fireplace and ended at the study desk, where one of my pens lay cracked in two, the nib bent, the ink dried on the table like a small black flower. I visited Margaret Kell again. She greeted me with narrowed eyes and a pot of weak tea already prepared, as if expecting me. I told her everything: basement noises, recorder movement, footprints. She didn't blink. Instead, she retrieved a yellowing notebook from her bookshelf and opened it to a page marked 1949. There were reports, she said, after the war, when rural telecommunications lines were first extended here. People spoke of echoes returning calls with wrong voices, not distorted, just misaligned. She pointed to a line in the notebook. Voice online matches resident's timbre, but uses words not spoken. Speaks in reverse pronouns, requests access. I read it twice, then asked, "What happened to them?" Margaret closed the book. The reports stopped, but not the occurrences. They stopped writing because no one would print them. I returned home late, with the wind behind me. The gate to the garden had been left open. I never left it open. It scraped against the side wall, rhythmically, like a weak heartbeat. Inside, the house was colder than it had any right to be. I turned on every lamp, lit the fireplace, made tea just to hear the kettle. Still, the rooms felt empty. Not vacant emptied. As if something had passed through and taken presence with it. I sat at the desk, checked my notebook, tried to organize my thoughts. But something pulled me to the study drawer. Inside was an old photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. My father standing in front of the same shed where I had buried the tapes. He was smiling, but his shadow stretched in the wrong direction. The sun, clearly behind him, cast a shape forward, yet the silhouette bent left toward the camera. I stared at it until my eyes hurt. I flipped it over. On the back, in my handwriting, a date, July of 1959. But I never remembered labeling it. I hadn't started journaling photos until the 70s. That night, I received a letter. No stamp, just an envelope slid under the front door. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper. Typed, not handwritten, it read, "Return what speaks, or it will speak through you." No signature. The paper smelled faintly of vinegar and soot. I burned it in the fireplace and sat there until dawn, watching the blackened corners curl and fall like dead petals. In the quiet that followed, I began to wonder, not about ghosts, but about mechanisms. About the possibility that something had learned me. Not haunted me, not watched, but rehearsed. That it had used my recordings as a guide, and now rehearsed my breath, my habits, my thoughts. As if it were slowly crafting a second self beneath the skin of memory. By the 24th, my reflection had begun to misbehave. It sounds impossible, absurd, but it is true. Twice I walked past the hallway mirror and noticed a delay. My reflection blinked slower than I did. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough that I stood still, breathing with care, watching for synchronization. Once I tilted my head. The reflection followed, a beat late. I covered the mirror with an old blanket and moved every other reflective surface out of the house. It made daily life difficult, but it was the only thing that calmed me. Until I turned on the radio, just for background noise, and the speaker crackled with my voice. Not my old voice, my current voice, saying things I hadn't said aloud. It said calmly, "You are missing now," followed by a burst of static and laughter, dry, breathless, rhythmic, not mocking, practiced, as if it had taken time to learn what laughter should sound like. I turned the radio off, unplugged it, threw it into the bin behind the shed. Then I sat all night, watching the threshold of each room like a border to be breached. The following week passed in a haze of restless nights and fitful days. The house seemed to shrink around me, every room folding inward as if the walls themselves leaned closer to whisper secrets I was not meant to hear. On the morning of the 29th, I found the front door unlocked again. Not merely ajar, but fully unlocked, the old brass knob cool and unyielding in my hand. I was certain I had locked it the previous night with my own keys and had double-checked before retiring. The lock showed no sign of tampering. I searched the entire house twice, calling out softly, hearing only Rook's low growl from the kitchen. He paced nervously, scratching the linoleum floor, his eyes darting toward the ceiling corners as if watching invisible currents. On that same day, the first tangible loss occurred. A silver teaspoon, simple, engraved with faint floral designs, vanished from the cutlery tray. Not misplaced, but gone entirely. I retraced every step, emptied drawers, overturned cushions, but found nothing. The spoon was nowhere. I began to suspect the presence wasn't merely auditory or spectral, but physical in some unsettling sense. The disappearance coincided with the nightly phenomena, the spontaneous activation of the recorder, the breathing upstairs, the footsteps on the carpet. I installed a small bell by the kitchen door, rigging it from an old bicycle bell I found in the garage. I rang it myself, testing the mechanism's reliability, and found it perfect, crisp, bright, impossible to miss. Yet one morning I woke to silence and a missing bell. It had been removed from the hook and was nowhere to be found, despite thorough searching. Each night after that, the recorder played softly in the study, running low hums, faint breathing, and sometimes faint whispers. I listened closely, straining for words or clues, but only fragments floated through the static, indistinct and broken. In early March, I reached out to a university professor specializing in acoustics and paranormal phenomena, a man named Dr. Wilbur Crane. His research was obscure, but respected in certain circles for his experiments with sound waves and their effects on human perception. He agreed to visit and examine the house, intrigued by my descriptions and the tape samples I mailed. His arrival was a brief respite from solitude. He was a tall man with a thinning beard and cautious eyes, the type who measured silence as carefully as sound. We spent hours in the study, where the recorder had last played by itself. Dr. Crane ran frequency analyses on the tapes and the ambient noises I recorded with a separate device. He discovered unusual anomalies, background frequencies that resembled vocal modulations but were artificially layered, almost as if a second voice was encoded beneath mine. He hypothesized it might be a natural phenomenon, perhaps related to the unique construction of the house's walls and magnetic properties of the soil beneath. "Your house acts like a resonator, trapping and layering sound waves," he explained. "But this is more than just echoes. It's interference, a kind of vocal overlay." That night, while Dr. Crane stayed in the guest room, I slept fitfully in the living room. Around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by the faint sound of whispering from the kitchen. The dog had gone silent, ears flat against his skull. I followed the noise, cautious and tense, only to find the kitchen light flickering weakly despite the bulbs being unscrewed for the day. The whispers ceased as I entered, replaced by a sudden cold draft sweeping through the room. I caught a glimpse of something flickering at the edge of my vision, a shadow not quite human, shifting just beyond the doorway. I blinked, and it was gone. I returned to the living room to find Dr. Crane sitting upright in the armchair, eyes wide and fixed on a spot near the ceiling. When I asked, he said nothing. The next morning, he handed me a sheet of notes, scribbled furiously in the dark, mentioning voice displacement, audio parasitism, and cognitive resonance. He warned me that whatever was manifesting in my home was likely feeding on my own vocal patterns, adapting, learning. Days later, the disturbances escalated. The house no longer seemed to obey the laws of cause and effect. The floorboards groaned with no apparent weight, doors slammed without wind, and objects moved just beyond the edge of sight. One evening, I returned to find the mirror in the hallway shattered, glass spiderwebbed across the floor, no stone, no sign of impact. Rook refused to enter the corridor, growling low and trembling. The smell of burning wire filled the air, though no appliance was on or damaged. I covered the shards with a sheet, taped the frame tightly, and avoided the hallway altogether. Sleep was nearly impossible. The breaths upstairs returned, now accompanied by a faint rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. I tried to record it, but the machines failed. The batteries drained overnight, despite fresh replacements. By the 12th of March, I was convinced the house was no longer mine, that I had become a tenant in a place haunted not by ghosts, but by my own voice twisted beyond recognition. The tape with the strange recording had long since been buried. The diary filled with observations and hypotheses, yet none explained the increasing aggression of the presence. I realized then the phrase, "he's already near," was no mere warning, but a declaration of arrival. It was not a distant threat, but something inextricably tied to me, learning, growing, preparing to cross from sound into flesh, from recording into reality. By mid-March, my days and nights blurred together in a cycle of unease and fractured attention. The loss of objects continued. A brass key from the kitchen drawer, a worn leather-bound book from the study shelf, a pair of spectacles left carefully on the bedside table. Each disappearance was swift and complete, leaving no trace or explanation. The air in the house carried a coldness that no fire could chase away, and even Rook seemed to carry a growing fear, his growls deepening to low, mournful howls in the dark. I began to keep the windows locked and the curtains drawn. But the sensation of being watched only intensified. There was no one, yet every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind felt like a presence moving just beyond sight. One afternoon, I sat with Dr. Crane on the worn leather couch in the study, trying to piece together the fragments of this growing mystery. He spoke cautiously about cases from the past, obscure archives of haunted houses where similar phenomena had been reported. "Not ghosts," he said, "not spirits in the traditional sense. What you're dealing with is a form of memory echo, a parasitic recording embedded in your environment. It mimics your voice, your behavior, but with subtle, disturbing deviations." He showed me charts of sound wave overlaps, annotated tape transcripts. "It learns from you," he said, "adapts to your speech, tries to replace your identity." The idea was chilling, but it fit too closely with what I'd witnessed. I found myself scrutinizing my own reflection in the window glass, wondering if the figure looking back was truly me or some echo waiting to take over. That evening, the disturbances grew more physical. The house's atmosphere thickened as shadows lengthened unnaturally. I noticed fresh scratches on the wooden floor near the fireplace, claw marks that hadn't been there before, sharp and irregular. Rook whimpered and hid under the bed. The recorder, left unplugged and sealed in its case, was found turned on again, capturing ragged breaths and something else, soft, guttural sounds I could not place. I played back the recording repeatedly, every static-laced whisper sending chills down my spine. At one point, a distorted voice spoke in a slow, broken tone. "You are not alone. He watches." I questioned my own hearing, but the words repeated, clear and unyielding. I attempted to document the phenomena meticulously, writing down every event with exact times and descriptions. But the entries became fragmented, my handwriting increasingly erratic. My sleep was consumed by nightmares of being trapped beneath the house, unable to escape as voices layered over mine, drowning out my thoughts. One morning, I woke to find the garden gate wide open again, despite being locked the previous night. Near the gate lay a small scrap of paper, yellowed and torn, with a hastily scrawled message: "Return what is borrowed." I had no memory of leaving or finding it. The handwriting resembled my own, but was shakier, uneven. Compelled by a need to understand, I began researching local archives and old newspapers. I uncovered reports from decades earlier. Stories of families displaced by unexplained occurrences, of voices recorded on early phonographs that were never spoken aloud, of possessions and disappearances linked to the rural area. One article detailed a case from 1948 involving a young man who kept a voice diary and disappeared without a trace after claiming something else spoke through me. The similarities were unsettling. I shared these findings with Dr. Crane, who nodded grimly. "History repeats itself when unresolved forces linger," he said. "Your house is a conduit, a place where voices trapped between worlds find form." The culmination came unexpectedly. One night, as a fierce storm raged outside, the electricity flickered and died. In the thick darkness, the recorder clicked on by itself, the tape spinning slowly. I sat frozen, clutching a candle. From the speakers came a voice, clear, steady, but not mine. It spoke directly, cutting through the static. "He is here. Soon, he will speak through you." The phrase echoed in the room, growing louder, merging with the howling wind and the dog's frantic barking. I felt a cold breath on my neck and knew the presence was no longer waiting, it had arrived. The nights grew heavier after that storm, the air thick with a tension I could no longer ignore. Every sound in the house seemed magnified, the ticking of the clock, the distant creak of settling timber, the subtle rustle of fabric as Rook moved uneasily beside me. The recorder became a fixture of my waking hours. I found myself constantly rewinding and replaying the tapes, desperate to catch every whispered syllable, every inflection that might reveal what was happening. The voice was no longer a distant echo, but a presence that loomed close, like a shadow cast by my own breath. On one recording, I heard fragments of sentences that made no sense, a stuttering refrain of words blending into a single chilling message. "He walks with you. He waits inside." I started locking every door and window, double-checking each latch before sleeping, but the feeling of vulnerability never left me. The household items continued to disappear. My grandfather's pocket watch vanished from the mantelpiece. A worn wool scarf was missing from the coat rack. Even my notebook with all my notes was gone one morning. Each loss left me more isolated, the house shrinking into a labyrinth of shadows and unanswered questions. I was certain now that the presence was not a simple haunting, but something more insidious. Something that fed on my memories, my voice, my very identity. It was as if the house had become a trap, and I its prisoner. One evening, during a rare visit from my neighbor, Mrs. Langston, an elderly woman with a sharp mind and a fondness for local history, I shared what had been happening. Her expression grew grave as I described the strange recordings and the inexplicable disappearances. She told me about a family that once lived here, back in the 1920s, a family that had experienced similar phenomena, ending in the sudden death of the father and the disappearance of the eldest son. "Some places hold the memories of pain and fear," she said quietly, "and sometimes those memories try to speak again." Her words lingered in my mind long after she left, blending with the whispers that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. That night, the house was restless. The floors groaned with unseen weight, and the recorder turned on without prompting. The tape played ragged breaths, interspersed with faint footsteps pacing in a slow rhythm. I followed the sound up the narrow staircase to the attic, a dusty room filled with forgotten relics and cobwebs. There, the temperature dropped sharply, and I saw, reflected in the grimy window pane, a figure standing just behind me, a dark silhouette, indistinct but undeniably present. I spun around, heart pounding, but found only empty air. Returning downstairs, I found the recorder's tape jammed, the device silent once more. Sleep became a battleground. I dreamed of voices layered upon my own, whispering secrets I could not comprehend. The phrase from the tape haunted me. "He walks with you." Was the presence inside me? Was it becoming part of who I was? I feared I was losing grip on reality, that the boundaries between my own identity and this strange entity were blurring. I recorded my thoughts in a new diary, desperate to hold on to my sense of self, but the words felt fragile, slipping through my fingers like smoke. One morning, I woke to find the study window wide open, despite the storm that had passed hours before. Inside, the room was untouched, except for one thing: the recorder, lying face down on the floor, its tape unraveled and tangled like a bird's nest. Nearby, a single page torn from my notebook lay crumpled, with the words scrawled hastily in my handwriting. "He is here." The chilling certainty of those words settled over me like a shroud. Whatever was with me in that house had crossed some threshold. It was no longer content to watch from the shadows. It wanted to be known, to be heard, to be. The days that followed the discovery of the open window and the shredded tape marked a turning point, though whether for better or worse. I could not say. The house seemed to pulse with an uneasy energy, as if aware of my increasing desperation to comprehend the nightmare unfolding within its walls. I began to keep meticulous notes, documenting every anomaly with painstaking care. The time it occurred, the exact sounds I heard, the physical sensations that accompanied each event. My handwriting, once hurried and anxious, steadied into clear, deliberate script, an attempt to anchor my unraveling mind. The diary entries revealed a mind on edge but determined, each line filled with observations and theories drawn from research, memories, and the fragments of the strange recordings I had salvaged. One afternoon, as rain lashed against the windows and the wind tore at the eaves, I noticed something peculiar. The shadows cast by the flickering fireplace no longer moved naturally. Instead of stretching and shrinking with the flames, they seemed to pulse and writhe, as if alive. I watched in growing horror as a shadow separated from the wall, stretching toward me in a slow, deliberate movement. It stopped just inches from my feet before dissolving back into the darkness. This moment shattered the last of my rational defenses. The presence was not only audible or tactile, it was capable of manipulation, of reaching into my space and defying the laws of nature I had once taken for granted. That night, I tried to sleep in the study, surrounded by the books and papers that had become my only companions. Rook lay beside me, restless and alert. The recorder, placed carefully on the desk, remained silent for the first time in days. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., a sudden chill filled the room, and the tape began to whir to life. A voice emerged from the static, slow and deliberate, distorted yet unmistakably familiar. It spoke my name, drawing it out with a cruel patience that froze my blood. "You cannot hide," it said. "He is already inside." The words echoed, looping endlessly, growing louder with each repetition until they overwhelmed my senses. I dropped the recorder, covering my ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate even that barrier. Desperation clawed at me. I resolved to leave the house, to escape this prison of sound and shadow, yet each attempt was thwarted. One evening, as I packed a small bag, the front door refused to open. I pulled with every ounce of strength, but the handle turned uselessly, as if held by an unseen force. Panic surged through in me, and I heard a voice whispering just beyond the door, indistinct but filled with menace. I slammed the bag down and retreated into the house, feeling the walls close in around me. The sense of isolation was complete. I was trapped, not just physically but mentally, caught in a web woven from my own voice and memories. I sought solace in the few remaining contacts I trusted, including Dr. Crane and Mrs. Langston. Dr. Crane suggested a series of experiments designed to disrupt the resonance that seemed to bind the presence to me. Using rudimentary equipment, speakers, tape recorders, and sound meters, we attempted to create interference patterns that might weaken the entity. We worked late into the night, surrounded by the hum of machines and the occasional growl from Rook. For brief moments, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house felt like a mere building again. But the relief was fleeting. The presence adapted quickly, returning with renewed vigor and more aggressive manifestations. Mrs. Langston brought something unexpected, an old family Bible, passed down through generations, rumored to have protective inscriptions written in the margins. Together, we examined the faded script, hoping for some anchor to ward off the darkness. I placed the Bible in the center of the living room, surrounding it with candles. That night, for the first time in weeks, the recorder remained silent, and the house felt almost normal. But as dawn broke, the pages of the Bible were found torn and scattered, the candles extinguished, and a faint, mocking laugh echoed through the empty rooms. It was a cruel reminder that the presence was not bound by religious or superstitious protections. The psychological toll was immense. I struggled to maintain a grip on reality, fighting waves of doubt and despair. Memories blurred, voices intertwined, and the boundaries between my own thoughts and the presence's influence became indistinct. At times, I questioned whether I was losing my mind or if Some part of me was willingly surrendering to the entity. My reflection in the cracked mirror sometimes seemed distorted, eyes darker, face gaunter. The phrase from the early recording, "He's already near," resonated with new meaning. I could feel him not just as a presence in the house, but as something inside me, a shadow that had crossed the threshold between voice and flesh. One evening, the culmination came with a final, terrifying clarity. I was alone in the study when the recorder sprang to life once more. The voice emerged, clear and commanding, no longer fragmented or distorted. "Speak through me," it demanded. The room grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I felt a force pressing against my throat, trying to make me speak words not my own. The battle for control was fierce and exhausting. In that moment, I understood the true nature of the presence. Not a mere echo or ghost, but a parasitic entity feeding on my identity, seeking to replace me entirely. The final nights were a battle between shadows and silence, my very existence hanging in the balance. The house no longer felt like a home but a cage, each room a battleground where my voice wrestled with the presence that sought to consume it. Sleep became impossible. The line between waking and dreaming blurred into a restless haze. I carried the recorder everywhere, hoping to capture evidence, to assert control over a reality slipping further beyond reach. The tape reels spun endlessly, filling the rooms with whispers and breaths that were not my own. Yet amid the chaos, a grim resolve took root. This would not end with me lost or silenced. One stormy night, when the rain hammered the windows and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, I took a final stand. Armed only with the recorder, a flashlight, and the tattered family Bible Mrs. Langston had given me, I ascended to the attic, the heart of the house's eerie disturbances. The air was icy, each breath visible in the faint beam of light. The silence was absolute, thick, expectant, as if the house itself held its breath. Then, as I pressed record, the voice emerged, low and sinister, calling my name with a venomous patience. "You belong to me now," it hissed. "Speak through me and surrender." I refused. I shouted back with every shred of will I had, a raw cry of defiance that echoed through the rafters. The presence thrashed and recoiled, the shadows writhing violently against the walls. The tape recorder captured the struggle, the voice overlapping mine, desperate to dominate. Then, in a moment of fragile silence, I spoke a single phrase, my own voice, clear and unwavering. "You do not own me." The house seemed to shudder, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for me to escape the attic's grasp. I fled downstairs, dragging the Bible behind me, its worn pages a talisman against the darkness. The recorder, still running, captured nothing but the natural creaks of the settling house. At dawn, the first weak light revealed the damage, the shattered window, the scattered remnants of the previous night's chaos. Yet within me, a fragile victory glimmered. The presence had retreated, subdued, but not destroyed. It remained a whisper in the walls, a shadow in the corners, waiting. The tape recordings, though filled with eerie voices and breathing, held my declaration, a beacon against oblivion. In the weeks that followed, normalcy slowly returned. Objects ceased to vanish. The cold air warmed, and Rook's restless howls quieted into gentle whimpers. I kept the recorder turned off, the diary closed, and the house locked tight. Yet sometimes, when the wind shifts just so and the shadows lengthen in the fading light, I catch a faint echo on the breeze, a fragment of a voice that is not quite mine, whispering through the silence. It is a reminder that some things never truly leave, that voices once recorded can linger in places forgotten by time. I have kept the tapes, sealed and hidden away, a chronicle of a time when my own voice betrayed me and a presence tried to claim my identity. The mystery remains unresolved, a thin veil between rational explanation and the inexplicable. What I know is this. In that house, in that time, I faced something beyond understanding, an echo of a forgotten past, a shadow that walked beside me. And though I live on, the question lingers. unanswered and cold. When does a voice become more than a voice? And who or what truly speaks when we think we are alone?